Welcome to American Ancestry Decoded, continuing to discuss freedom certificates and various what I call transition points in which the indigenous are transitioned from their own jurisdiction, their tribal jurisdiction, and into colonial and then later United States jurisdiction and into that system. So this is a look at some details of the paperwork and the process of how basically they would entrap and take control of of the indigenous people. So this might be in the form of orphanages, entering as an orphan, a widow, a warrior enslaved and shipped to another part of the land. Um, Higher level elite, basically youth hostage, almost like given over to the Europeans as collateral, right? Those are the one raised in universities or raised in wealthy households. Okay, that's like Frederick Douglass and his entire family for generations. Okay, so what we're all of that I call basically the I call it the hostaging system because to me that's like basically what it was. All right. So to understand how the indigenous became trapped by paperwork, it's like what was the paperwork and like what was also the physical reality that matched up with the paperwork to enforce the paperwork, right? So what's really going on here? Um, Start with this. So in the British High Court, a certificate of freedom, which is one of the key pieces of paper that I go into in one of my newest how-to manuals that talks about certificates of freedom and how to search for them at the county level and basically look up these records, which would basically demonstrate indigenous origin because these were specific for Indians. So in the High Courts, a certificate of freedom was an admiralty document granted to a captured enemy vessel. And once the court condemned the ship as a prize of war, a prize of the British war, the ship and the crew received a certificate of freedom to clear them for continued trade with the British. But of course, now they would be working for the British, and now they would get to continue it to use the trade routes. But now, of course, working for the British. In other words, they were kind of like enslaved in place, right? The British were like, "Aha, we've captured you as a prisoner of war. We're not going to kill everybody and blow up the ship. Instead, we're going to keep you all alive and continue to use you to work this ship and help us make money." So I just want to keep that in mind when I talk about all the time. One of the premises of my business and then my whole theory, whole channel on the website is what really happened is for the most part, they enslaved indigenous Indians in place. So it really went down. Now, the human translation of all this, when English colonizers established, colonies and counties and praying villages and settler villages and all that, they actually applied this maritime law. And so they would treat the indigenous like captured cargo, like ships that they've captured. Okay, and remember they were capturing ships that were using trade routes and sea lanes controlled by the British rather than controlled by the French or controlled by the Ottomans and on or the Spanish. So keep that in mind because then what they do in applying the system to land, right? They basically created instead of it being about sea lanes, it becomes turnpikes, bridges, uh, canals that get built, anything you can toll, a port, actual seaport. So those are kind of the four main pieces of infrastructure that basically are the land versions of sea lanes. So what are they doing? They're treating the indigenous who are on these land sea lanes as like ships that can be pirated along with the ship's cargo and the ship's crew. So you could capture a group of Indians. You said that, but I'm just letting you know this is literally, in the thinking, in the framework. Okay. And under this system, this concept of liberty, this is where this word liberty is really, I guess, really from admiralty law. And under this system, a sailor taken, hostage, so to speak, right? And now, having to work for the British, he would have to produce a passport, a physical piece of paper to be able to enter like any British controlled ports. Okay, or they can just take the ship, take everyone, make them work for them, right? So they were basically treating indigenous people using the roads that they control and the bridges, and then going, you're not authorized to use this. We don't have like a treaty with you. Hence, they would treat indigenous as quote unquote stateless assets, right? So another new word for Indians is they were stateless assets, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, it comes from British Admiralty law and really how they dealt with piracy and battles with the French and the Spanish and with supposedly independent merchants and pirates and all that that we read about. And they then apply this type of law on land, and they're treating again the Indians as thank you, appreciate that comment, just seeing that. Uh, and they so it's just, sorry about that, just checking things here. Um, it's odd, right? But it's also practical because now they don't have to write like a whole new body of law. So I can see them doing it from the point of view. But man, I mean, this is just pretty intriguing to really consider. And the reason I find this stuff out, not because I'm looking for it, but I just I stumbled across certificates of freedom. I can't remember how, and then working with AI, probing AI more on it, it then starts to reveal like origins and and I'm like, wow. So and then I could look at some sources myself from there and really see like, wow, this is really yeah, what they were doing. This naval and admiral kind of admiralty influence on it so much. I'm beginning to try and really open that up, the question like how much of this was about naval power, who were the as I've said in other things, the Colombians, right? The sons of Colombia that were seemingly involved in being taken enslaved on ships. If you read the literature and stuff, so okay, who are these guys? Yeah, that's for another time. But I'm just pointing out to you where there seems to be a lot of influence here about naval law and naval power. All right. So here's what's interesting, right? So what they would do is they created what were called freedom papers, all right? But here's what's interesting, that they're actually a state mandated tracking system for the indigenous. So if you wanted to operate on those turnpikes and go to the shipping ports because you're trying to do business, what have you, right? They're making you basically turn over all this information about yourself. So it's literally like it's almost like what we all go through today, where it seems like you're always having to turn over all kind of information of yourself in order to get an ID card or a credit card or whatever card you're trying to get, right? It's like this is what they're doing to the indigenous. So it's like supposedly, and I want to get some. I've looked at them online, but I want to get a physical one. These certificates of freedom have a lot of like biometric data, so it would really say something about someone's ancestors. It could, I'm just saying, it would have more than what you're ever going to see on the census and stuff, because it'll look for tattoos and earrings or whatever, jaw shape, all this type of stuff, because it's basically a passport. So they didn't have cameras, right? So they're basically trying to describe what we'd have a picture of nowadays. So that's why these certificates of freedom, which are also called freedom papers, are very intriguing from a genealogical and just family history perspective. Okay. Now, next thing is that these certificates, much like today's driver's licenses, passports, they have time limits. It was like annual or every 2 years. So basically, the indigenous would then have to go back, appear in the county court, pay fees to renew their certificate of freedom. And typically, even to get the first one, then all the repeat, you typically had a so-called white, a European, a colonial member of the team, right? Had to vouch for you, and so they would, stamp an affidavit type situation, right? And so, so basically, like, this is like the beginning of, like, you can see what became very normal is all these various, license fees, right? Right. I guess like we all pay a driver's license fee, right? We all pay a fee if you hunt or fish, like you pay a fee for the kind of right to get to go hunt and fish, right? So they're treating the indigenous like this from the beginning. Oh, you got to pay a fee if you're going to touch any of our transportation infrastructure. Okay. Now, you might ask yourself, like, why did the indigenous, why would my ancestors need their this canal? Well, because you got to remember that simultaneously they are building dams, and they're flooding a lot of indigenous agricultural fields, and so destroying those towns and that food supply. And at the same time, they're draining. Other swamps and creeks and rivers that the indigenous would have been moving their cargo down in order to get it to the port in Savannah. And now they've created a canal in a straight line right into Savannah. And that's like the only way from now you're going to be able to get product to the coast. So now the indigenous are like slowly but surely getting sort of surrounded by new transportation infrastructure, I think is what's really going on. It's how clever all of this is. Like I say, as much violence as we talk about, when you look at the recorded numbers, I mean, sometimes it'll boggle your mind that it's 1,000 Indians died and a couple thousand colonists, and like the whole state of North Carolina was one. It's like, okay, what's going on here, right? Like, where's everybody else, right? Well, maybe everybody else is getting caught in all this stuff. Like, I'm just trying to point out, like, uh, there was this big bureaucracy here involved in like recording all this that I'm talking about. And it just, I'm trying to put it together again. Why would the Indians go for this? Like, obviously were getting hemmed in, right? Somehow. And I think that's where it's like all of a sudden they can't, uh, you know, take the old waterways because they've used dams and they've used canals to move water around. It's really important to understand that that's what's going on, like from the beginning. All right. So this system I'm talking about, right? It basically sets up legal hostage and kidnapping. And it's not the only type of legal hostage and kidnapping we have either. We get into that in other reports. You can see some videos on that type of stuff. But in this situation, what's going on? If you're a indigenous person and you're making your way like during, you're on today's modern Florida Turnpike, and you don't have this certificate of freedom when you go under the toll, they can literally arrest this indigenous person as a stateless asset, a fugitive slave, a fugitive piece of property, like with no sovereign. So that's the other thing. Like, this plays into the fact that they did not recognize any of the indigenous tribes anymore. They wouldn't talk to them as nations unless they agreed to become one of the civilized nations. So what I'm talking about here applies to all the indigenous, the vast majority, in my opinion, that weren't a part of anything of the civilized nations for the most part. They get all the press, but I'm telling you, the biggest group of the indigenous is the one they don't talk about. It's the ones that didn't go on reservations, and didn't keep moving out west, but actually were getting involved in various ways into the system. All right. And ones we're talking about now are trying to continue to maintain their indigenous, tribal, and their community sovereignty while still using the European colonial infrastructure, which is now, rife with sheriffs and regulators. And it's a very militaristic group of people coming over doing the colonizing, right? We know that. And this is what they were doing. This is the type of stuff they were doing. And so it's not like they were going out into the indigenous villages all the time and trying to burn them. It was they were patrolling these transportation routes or ambushing people on the transportation routes. And they could, by their own English laws, European laws, take you hostage, take an indigenous hostage, just like that, entire family, entire group, whatever. And that was the setup. And then from there, you also have a source of the slave trade, being that they were, if they couldn't get bond, and basically they couldn't pay their way out, and also now pay to get a certificate of freedom, now they get sold into slavery. So there's a whole gigantic process, big history to this, and these things as records, as archives, would be quite an interesting gold mine. Basically, everybody listed ever as a free person of color or a free Negro that's a person that had a certificate of freedom. They were on the county's freedom register. Therefore, they are known as a free Negro or a free person of color. You see, so that anybody in your, so if you have in your ancestors somebody ever listed as that free person of whatever, there is somewhere, or there used to be, a certificate of freedom with that name. And then that certificate of freedom would describe their physicality. Probably they had to tell them where they lived, what tribe they were from. You might find out information you know that you don't have now, or just have it confirmed. You know. Oh, that's a great question. Personal bodyguard, huh? Yeah, I mean, you can shoot me an email on the website, or just message me. Absolutely, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so like I said, this is overall what I'm calling legal hostaging, right? So let's talk a little bit more what I mean by, like, so how does this work, right? Okay, so if you're caught, right, and so again, they grab you off the canal, they see you trying to sneak along in a small canoe in the shadows because you don't have this, they get you, all right, right. So what are they gonna do? They're gonna put you in detention, like I just said, right? And now nobody pays. Well, now you're going to become a slave, right? So that could happen, but I'm not going to go talking about slavery right now. I think we've all heard enough about it, one way or the other. But what is going to happen, or what mostly happens, and what is not talked about, is what's called the guardianship. So what they take, and this even with indigenous adults, not just for children. Okay, what they do is they basically have what's called a presumption of incompetence. They presumed all indigenous were incompetent to be able to exist and perform in this new system, this new European system of capitalism and banking and religion. Literally, that's what it was presumed. This is in their laws, right? So what would happen now is they have to assign you a guardian, make you a ward, a dependent on a ward with the guardian that has custody of you. This would happen to entire families, right? So state courts routinely declared you incompetent to manage your financial assets, your inheritance, your land deeds, and then assign a European guardian to manage the estate, right? Once they have that type of control over any type of titles and wealth, it basically they can abscond with it. All right. So, they'll get at least a slice of it as legal fees, but basically they have power of attorney over all the wealth. So this was like a form, this kind of guardianship would be typically applied to indigenous elites, children, and young adult offspring, right? So they know that they come from a family that has lots of land and businesses on that land, right? And now they're gonna, make the dad, they're gonna assign a guardian over this, elite indigenous man because they grabbed them, they grabbed them on the turnpike, they grabbed them on the canal, and you have a certificate of freedom. Now you see what happens is that type of indigenous man, on the other hand, would probably be able to raise the money, right? Because if he has land and wealth and cattle and all that, and buy his way out. So you can see how, like, you see what's going on here, right? Like if you got the means, like, they're going to get money out of you. If you don't have the means, they're going to sell you into slavery, and or take you into a guardianship situation. This is the slavery I'm focusing on here. So they would appoint a guardian. So we have to realize is when you see those pictures in the late 1800s of families of 15 and 18 kids, and you read about the 3 wives that came and died, that's not all DNA kids, man. That's like they were putting people together, adopted and mixed Indian orphans, with the Europeans. The Europeans are bringing all kinds of stuff's going on here. And the way that those fathers are actually guardians. These are guardians and godfather. So again, from right. So here's some interesting case studies on this. Mahoney versus Ashton, right? So 1791, a quote unquote enslaved man, right? Again, he's probably not enslaved, right? Now you know about the guardianship, right? He's probably not African. Now you get more informed, right? This guy name was Charles Mahoney. So keep about that. A black indigenous man named Charles Mahoney, 1791, files a petition for freedom against a Jesuit slaveholder, Father John Ashton. So again, you see how they write about it. To me, technically, this guy is not a slave. Legally, this man's not a slave. Slavery is always read. They always tell us slavery is lifelong, and you're like abject, just completely at the mercy of the slave owner. Suppose that's what we're always told. So how is this, enslaved man in 1791, Charles Mahoney, gets to go down the court and file a petition for freedom? Well, yeah, sounds like something we get to do nowadays. Or I get so, maybe we're enslaved, right? Think about it. And so he files it against Father John Ashton. What does Mahoney argue? This is the key point. Mahoney, the Indian, argues that he was legally free. You can call me a slave. You can try and be my guardian. I don't need a white guy to sign for me. Why? Because he was descended from a maternal indigenous ancestor named Anne Joyce. And Joyce was an endangered woman of a distinct indigenous descent who had been unlawfully held in lifelong bondage. This is very similar to Frederick Douglass's ancestry. It's his grandmom's generation that gets taken hostage really by a family on the Eastern Shore, and they in public, label them as slaves because they want to force them to stay past that age of 21 when they'd be released as citizens. What I've been just telling you. So they want to have their cake and eat it too, which is, keep them for life. they want to keep Frederick working for them for life. Okay, so there's a whole thing to that, and they just proved that they weren't African. They were from the indigenous in Maryland. And they actually, one of the key pieces of evidence was they had the guardian bonds, to prove that they were originally assigned as guardians to the family. They were not slaves. All right. So let's keep going. So what happens well, basically the court case goes on for like 12 years. And they finally decided that Mahoney's body and his labor had been held hostage. And therefore, he wins the case, but he goes bankrupt, like winning it, basically. All right. So, but the point I want to make is he was defending his freedom, right, by saying, I'm indigenous. That's basically his claim. All right. They studied two New York's musty MUSTEE ledgers, right? So and I've read the legislation on this. Very interesting. Again, proves my point that they were taking into their homes and into the missions and in these orphanages indigenous people, right? And so here's the same pattern appears. The classification of musties, right? During New York's gradual slavery emancipation acts of 1799 and 1817. They had county level manumission ledgers to track the so-called non-white population. Who is the non-white population? New York laws also held that children born to the mustee, which was Indians, after 1799 were technically free. Get this, but they were immediately subjected to the state's guardianship laws. So here's what they're doing, guys, in the North. When you hear they're telling you and us that the North passed all these laws in New England, they freed their slaves by like 1800. Here's what they were actually doing to the indigenous. They were freeing them. They were giving them these certificates of freedom, but they, of course, like I said earlier, to get that certificate of freedom, you had to have a European, a white person vouch for you. That's the person that's going to become your guardian. So to operate at all, you have to be dependent legally, like a legal shield with a white. And so immediately these musty women are being deemed. So, hey, you're no longer, no longer gainfully employed. We don't have to employ you for life and follow any laws to support you anymore. Go report as a pauper because now you have no income. You gotta remember, they would free the slaves, and just like you read about after the Civil War in the South, the same thing was happening up. They knew it was going to happen. They freed the slaves. The slaves had no income so they turn around in the North. They turn them into paupers. They register as paupers, and then they get bound back out to the very same people that used to have to support them. It's very upside down the way they talk about slavery compared to everything else that was really going on. That's my take on it. All right. So again, they're deemed civilly incompetent. They can't. So that's a guaranteed pipeline of orphans, right? They're literally saying, Indian woman who, we've killed your husband or we've slave traded him away because he was a warrior. Uh, and according to our laws, because you're not converted, you're assumed incompetent. And we can't have you raising a child if you're incompetent. So we're going to take your children and put them in our orphanage. Yep. You see what's going on here? This is how nasty this stuff is, and this is what's going on all throughout the New England and the North, Midwest. This is how they're forcing the indigenous into the system. Mm, This is what's going on. And then the children, as if they're older, orphaned older, they're going to be bound out. They're going to be working for someone and not getting paid. Again, he doesn't have that certificate of freedom. If you escape, you can't use the roads, you can't use the canals. Thank you for joining. This is American Ancestry Decoded. My name is Travis, founder and host. All right, so a little bit on bonds. That's just kind of maybe a little bit intriguing here. Okay, so you would have basically what happens is the wealthy person pledges a lot of money to maintain and educate the child, the ward, right, who's dependent on the guardian basically pays money into the government, and it's basically saying, this is my guarantee that we will convert and usefully deploy for work, for our purposes, this Indian. So it's like basically saying, I'm gonna take care of this person to at least 21, and then they're gonna come out and become one of us, a settler, and later on a citizen. And then at that point, I get my money back from the government. It's really fascinating. Now remember, the guardian is making money off the indigenous people that he becomes a guardian of. That's how, when it says, when I was saying earlier that they get indentured out. So the owners of the orphanage are making money by indenturing out, contracting out the working age children. That's what's really going on. Of the chief. So again, how do they, not only are they forcing, one of the princesses to marry, you know, into to this Englishman in order to like ensure, quote unquote, good behavior of the local tribes around Savannah. They now hostage the nephew of the chief, Tuna Howard. This is written right. I mean, you can just read it, right out of the Methodist book. This is actually, conventional history will admit to this. You can figure this out like legally from a 1734 chancery bond. The guardian James Oglethorpe, 500-pound bond paid the condition to lodge the youth, this Tuna Howie, at the academy in Kensington. It's telling us that James Oglethorpe, the big founder of Georgia, put in 500 pounds, which is, like $500,000 today, to the government in England with a chancery bond and guaranteeing, hey, I'm going to train up this young prince out of the Savannah area in Georgia, Tuna Howie. All right. And we're going to lodge him at the academy in Kensington. So that's basically like, going to elite academy training in London, 1734. And then he ends up becoming a surveyor working under a man named Noble Jones in Georgia. So he's redeployed. Tuna Howie is redeployed to do very valuable what surveying of the rest of Georgia. If you listen to me discuss George Washington and how he represents his life, represents the financial system of colonization and up through the Revolutionary War and all that. You know, you'll realize how important surveying is. And I keep telling people, surveyors were most likely converted indigenous and redeployed indigenous people. They wanted to really bury a lot of this history. They didn't want to really won't really talk about it. They had concocted the African slavery narrative, and they'd gotten redemption, right? Because the Civil War was fought to free the African slaves. So hey, we're good. We don't need, we can pat ourselves on the back. We're forgiven. We're born again. We've redeemed ourselves. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's what I think's going on. Now, here's a great example of it. Frederick Douglass. I have an entire report on the website. You can get at, because I take it and say, hey, this is how you could do your own family history. There's another ledgers to look at, and this is why this makes sense, especially if you have northern ancestry. I guess Maryland's not. So just to show you how real this is and practical, in May 2026, the DNA results triggered litigation known as, I quote, the tidal claims, tidal as in tidal basins, or, tidal basin, tidal claims. So they're talking about the Eastern Shore, where descendants are using this biological evidence to challenge 200-year-old bureaucratic erasures. They are targeting the chain of title for some of the most valuable real estate on Maryland's Eastern Shore. Currently, you have the court case Bailey versus the state of Maryland. This is the anchor court case sitting before the Maryland Court of Appeals. They argue that because of the 1822 legislation that just dissolved the Choptank 5,000 acres of remaining land, okay, and this was based on what the legislature called the extinction of the tribe. You see what's going on? So I'm going to look more into this. I bet I'll see this that year in and year out of different states. There's a reason they like to declare the tribes extinct. Look what they're doing here in 1822. You can go read the legislation yourself. They justify taking the remaining 5,000 acres that Frederick Douglass's ancestors, the Baileys, or an English name, the Baileys, were living on since the 1669 treaty. And they're saying, we're going to take the remaining 5,000 because the tribe's extinct. So what they want is a recovery of the Choptank land fund adjusted for 200 years of compound interest. The court is actually reviewing this 2026 DNA evidence map alongside the 1693 deeds to prove the state knowingly unpeopled, made, extinct, a sovereign nation. The state of Anthony's were the guardians of Douglas's ancestors and Douglas himself. The state of Anthony versus the trustees of the Y House. This case targets the private land holdings of the planter elite families of the Eastern Shore. They are suing to reclaim portions of the Y House estate, WYE. They are using the guardian bonds. The suit argues that the Anthonys committed title fraud by moving individuals from temporary apprenticeships to permanent slaves to prevent them from inheriting or owning land that they should have been given based on that 1669 treaty. The court has issued a stay on any land development in the area until the indigenous English status of the 1800 occupants is audited. Finally, there's another one about recording fees and bonds paid by the Baileys between 1790 and 1864. They say that the state of Maryland operated an unconstitutional tax system by forcing indigenous descended people to buy, I quote, certificates of freedom for rights they already had under the 1669 treaty with the state of Maryland. Reparations, they seek a refund of all manumission and certificate fees. Remember, I told you they'd make your ancestors re-up that certificate every year, every couple of years. So this is real. This is like as real as passports and driver's licenses and whatever other IDs we all have, right? You work at an office park in the building, you got to have that ID. This is another ID. But it was specific to indigenous. This isn't the type of ID they were handing out to European paupers or, and all that. This isn't something they were handing out to freed African slaves. Freed African slaves would have like manumission papers, but they're not doing their certificate of free. It doesn't have anything to do with them. So it's pretty wild, right? And so they want a reparation. So they've calculated reparations for all the fees, and the way they calculate another reparation they want is, besides they're suing to get the land back. part of the treaty, part of the legislation in the 1800s was the legislator was supposed to pay the tribe in cash, and of course they didn't pay the tribe in cash. But on the public record, it shows that, see, this is how nasty these European, these white this is 1800s now, white legislatures were when they were taking over things, especially in the 1800s. Look at this. They basically, in their own treasury, directed $18,400 from the Chop-Tonk Land Fund to the commissioners of Washington, D.C., in order to grade the Pennsylvania Avenue and cut stones for the new Treasury building. So the current people and descendants of Frederick Douglass are suing. One of the lawsuits is wanting the recovery of that $18,400 at interest. I think this is great. So this just shows you how documented the details are of the hostaging system I'm talking about. Interesting. Yeah, the charters, right? So you talk about the Lord proprietors, right, and stuff like that. So that's well, they didn't really get you. Yeah, how do they get control of them? They didn't. They were out there surveying them, right? So to me, and I would like this. That's a good question. I'd have fun researching that because it would build on what I've learned about surveying. So the way I understand it, and I have researched this. What basically I've researched like how do these proprietors make any money for a while. And basically, what they were is they set up land offices, and the way they were really making money before they're even getting any trade or from the indigenous to like export, right? That's the ultimate goal, right? To set up like an export shop, But before that can happen, because your point, like we're all the enforcers, right? We're all the Europeans, and this gives again. I'm telling you, they weren't bringing over Europeans. This is what they do: is send up a land office, and basically they got to get stuff surveyed, because once you have the land under in that proprietorship surveyed, now it's entering the banking and the legal system, and now people will start literally buying plots or buying rights to purchase plots that are surveyed. I mean, this is where I've talked about using George Washington. Land gets surveyed for 30, 40, 50 years before they would physically get control of it and have kicked off and displaced any indigenous. So 1606, yeah, they didn't actually control much at all, but they are getting the surveys out there, and are gonna make money selling those survey pieces of paper. That's going to start the money flow, and those surveys, as they begin to kick and displace indigenous off and get control of a village, get control of what we might call today a county, right? Now they can turn it into land patents, right? And now you start selling the land patents, because the land patents are only kick in when they can claim they have control of the ground. Yeah, it is a whole ritual, or what we might call, race of thieves for sure. Whole processes that they follow them. That this is all good. This is all lawful, all legal. So great question. And yeah, the survey, understanding the power and the meaning of the survey is huge. And that's why, they would they would keep coming, because they just would get things surveyed. And once things are surveyed, they've like gathered intel on the land. They know where the good forts are, where they should put forts. They know where they could put. There's a lot of detail in these original surveys. They're a form of like military intelligence or business intelligence as well. Where they should colonize. So then like boards of directors would be like, oh wow, I want that plat, that survey number 1702-A1. I really like that. It has a creek running through it and a slough, and then it looks like there's a hill right here. You could put it, that's literally what they're doing with these things, even though like you just said, there's nobody really there physically. So, but the system's moving, the money's moving, they're circling, right? And now the clock's ticking to how long it's going to take until there's boots on the ground. Eventually there's violence, right? And that out of that violence comes what? The orphans. It comes, the kids put into the missions, comes the elite being hostage at wealthy guardians, or forced into the universities, or sent all the way back to academies in London, as I did with Savannah Indians, okay, as I was going over earlier. So that's what was going on, So thanks again for joining. Again, this was covering guardian bonds, certificates of freedom. Uh, this stuff would fall if you're working on family history and genealogy, hit brick walls. You're not really getting, you know, where was somebody born or so, or you just gotta, you don't know who the mother is or something like that, or when they start, or they just show up on a census roll. But what was going on in the previous decade, right? Because census only every 10 years. And that's just the beginning. That's the last thing you get as early as you can go back. These other archives would have stuff, that could put you in there. The certificates of freedom, and then these are everywhere, basically every state out, especially outside the South, for sure. Or there's orphan courts, there's guardian accounts, there's poor law, indenture books. Poor law indenture is the paupers. Remember, they make them register as paupers with the county, and then the county makes money by contracting them out to work for all the businesses and farms. And then after that 7 years, they let them graduate and become a citizen. So you see, you were presumed incompetent. You had to go through this process and ritual to be competent to participate in this new banking capitalist, republic that they're creating, right? Chancery court cases, all kinds of things. There's black code registers, orphans court minutes, guardian accounts. Yeah, I've really looked up a lot of stuff, and it's like it's wild. Now, I think a lot of this is still there. It's just these are quietly maintained. This isn't the type of stuff people want to talk about. They want to talk about brutal Southern slavery over and over again, and then they gloss over all this. And this is like, I think, the real slavery. This is like where the real action was. The true brutality was going on. This explains all the asylums. This explains all the orphanages. That's what it explains it. All the Indian schools and the mission schools, right? Who are they missionizing? Who are they converting? Right? Right? So certificates of freedom, guardian bonds, two great archives to look at, where you could find information that would list details, physical details, perhaps where they lived, what tribe they were with, because they were basically trying to capture all this information on the indigenous in exchange for not enslaving them while they used the roads, the toll roads, the canals, the bridges. And remember, as the towns are getting built out, you're trying to skip around town or through town on a shortcut, they grab you, you know. So this is what was really going on, and this is like really talked about. So if you're running down your ancestry and you're either looking only at census forms, or you're just looking at tribal rolls, tribal rolls are a small percentage of the overall amount of melanated people that are here and were here. If you add up all those numbers, yeah, it's kind of shocking, really. And I'm going to get into that in a report soon. So, where, is that it? Oh, I'm not on the rolls and I just have some stuff, some census stuff, and that's all I'm ever going to know. I think maybe not. I think there are all these other archives that are at the county level. They're not at the federal government, but they're at the county. And then there's other types of archives that might not be at the official county government archives, but a lot of these counties will have private archives. They will have a major, what used to be a family mansion or something turned into basically an entire, genealogical like records mansion, so especially in the small towns, all right, because people have left, they've died out, or they moved on, and they actually turn over their records and their archives and their family Bibles because they don't want it to just get lost eventually by, careless descent. Yeah, it's real stuff. I've talked to some about this. So you'd be surprised, right? So you're not going to find this in the federal government, and you're not going to find it on the tribal rolls. So This is the paper that covers the vast majority of Black Americans' ancestors. You know, that I actually think is going to show it. What you see after the Civil War in the South is exactly what they've been doing everywhere else the whole time, forcibly teaching English, forcibly becoming Christians, right? Right? Forcing them now into the new system with fences and monoculture and pay. It is a whole thing. The South didn't pay, individual taxes and all this. They paid in. There's a whole thing we don't understand about the pre-war South. It was not on the same system as the North. Bottom line. So now I'm telling you what that system was in the North, really. Now you understand the labor system of the North, because they weren't bringing in millions of Europeans over all that time. So who was doing the work? Now you know how they were doing the work, yet not technically being slaves. So again, thanks for joining. I'm going to sign off here. It's been about an hour. You can check it out on the website. I have a how-to manual, how to use certificates of freedom to continue to research your lineage. And also it just helps you understand the context of what a lot of the indigenous, whether converted or not, we're going through, and how to really, it'll just give you a better understanding of the various ways that these colonizers were entrapping uh, your ancestors, right? Looking in there. All right. So again, thanks for joining. This is American Ancestry Decoded, where remembrance conquers oblivion.